Social Studies 30-1 position paper tutorial. You should have written one of these in grade 10 and probably at least two of them in grade 11. You probably forgot, and if you do, that's okay. I'm going to take you through over the next few minutes and talk about how you put together a good position paper, critical for social studies and I think a lot of university classes too. So this is the way it's going to work. You are going to get a source. So here's an example of a source that I've got on the screen right now. In fact, this is the paper that I'm going to assign to you later on in the lesson. Anyway, you're going to get a source, and step one is going to be interpreting what that source is actually trying to say. What you'll want to do is you'll want to point out certain pieces of the source and expand on them. So to me, when I'm looking at the source, I'm thinking, well, what is self-interest? What could that mean? What would that look like? To me, self-interest would be maybe capitalism, the pursuit of profit, doing things for money. Another thing I might look at would be disadvantaged members of the community. Who would that be referring to? Maybe the poor, maybe economically marginalized people, maybe people that can't look after themselves. You'd want to expand on that too. And as well, I'm thinking the state. The state would mean government, government intervention perhaps. And this last passage as well that I would point out would be active role to serve the greater good. So what is an active role? To me, again, that is government intervention in the economy, and the greater good is what is best for the community, what is best for everyone in the community, and maybe not just the elite. What is the greater good? Probably you'd want to link that to quality of life. You might want to work in longevity somehow too. And by that I mean the planned economy of the Soviet Union worked for a while, and one could argue it did serve the greater good for a while, but it didn't last. That economy collapsed on itself by the early 1990s. So that's what would go into the interpretation of a source. It's not like the daily source analysis where we go on at length. We briefly want to talk about important pieces from the source. So this will change depending on the position paper that you're assigned to write, the source. What will always be the same is what you need to do, and that is what is listed in this bottom box. So you'll always be answering that question, and you'll always be referring to those bullets listed in this rectangle on my computer screen. Your answer to the question will be what is known as a thesis, and this wording will never change in a social studies position paper. The only thing that's going to change is going to be the source itself. Remember to organize this paper. Remember to proofread this paper. So there you go. That is the source I'm going to assign later on in the block. Next thing I'd like to point you in the direction of, I guess, is just a brief summation of what you need to do in a position paper. All you need are 5 paragraphs. You can have more. If you're a good writer and you can expand beyond 5 paragraphs, that's fine. But bare minimum, you need at least 5 paragraphs. Paragraph 1 is what we call the introduction. And this is what goes into the introduction of a social studies position paper. Bear in mind, there are all kinds of papers. There's a paper for English, etc. This is what we do in social studies. So step 1, like I talked about, is you need to interpret and comment on the source. What is that source trying to say? Again, you want to link it to liberalism. It's a course about ideologies and liberalism. You want to link it to liberalism. So what is that guy trying to say? You'll want to quote passages from the source, expand on them, and try and give that person's underlying ideological perspective. So if we go back to the source we've already started to look at, this person is advocating for a greater degree of collectivism based on the words he's picked and how he puts them together. This guy wants more collectivism, and that is his ideological perspective. You'll want to identify the dilemma that is raised by the source. So in this case, the dilemma, and you can kind of use the question to go with that. To what degree, should governments be involved in the economy? That is the dilemma that you need to uncover in this paper. A position paper needs to be objective. It means that you've got to examine both points of view and come to a conclusion and defend it. So you need to be objective. You need to recognize that, yes, you've got your point of view, but there are going to be other points of view as well. And you don't have to defend those other points of view, but you at least have to recognize there are other points of view and why they would think that. So again, if we go back to our source today, this person is advocating for greater degrees of economic intervention. So I would need to explain why someone might agree with that perspective and why someone would disagree with that perspective. And I'll briefly talk about why they would think that. So if someone was to defend collectivism, they would say blah, blah, blah. And if someone was to disagree with collectivism, they would say blah, blah, blah. And you're keeping that brief and to the point, but you do have to recognize that. Finally, you want to talk about the theorists that would go with this. And by that, I mean your economic theorists, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and so on. So when looking at our source, this is something that Karl Marx, an advocator of collectivism, would agree with. He would applaud this source. Adam Smith would be suspicious about this source. Adam Smith would go, no way, this source is not going to work for me and my ideal society. Finally, toward the end of your introduction, you will unveil your thesis, which is what you think. A thesis needs to be clear, concise. My advice would be keep it simple. Here's what you're going to try and say. Here's how you're going to defend it. I'll show you some examples of some theses later. And at the end, if you want, at the end of your intro, you can briefly introduce your three major arguments. So what we actually want in the intro is an upside down triangle. We're going to start very generally, and we're going to get specific as that introduction wears on. In fact, we're not going to give away the thesis until the very end of the introduction. So thesis should come at the end. You're general, and now you become specific. That's how you establish objectivity. If you blurt out the thesis in the first sentence of the intro way too soon, how can you be objective if you're going to defend a position before you even explore the issue first? So there's my advice on the intro. A good position paper intro is at least a half a page in a 12-point font, single-spaced. Paragraph 1. Now we move on to the body. The body is going to be paragraphs 2, 3, and 4. So you're going to need to establish and defend 3 arguments that defend your thesis. So the first argument is just going to be built upon a topic sentence. And again, I'm going to show you some examples of this in action in a few minutes. But argument 1 will begin with the topic sentence. Going to want to be clear, going to want to be direct. And then for each topic sentence, you've got to defend that argument with at least 2 examples. 3 is better. Rule of thumb in social studies history is that if you can think of 1 example of something, that's okay. But that could just be a coincidence or luck. If you can think of 2 examples, well, now you're getting somewhere. If you can think of 3 examples that defend an argument or a topic sentence, now you've established a pattern. Now we're getting somewhere. We're establishing something. And with each example, you need to explain them too. So you've got to explain your example with logic and reason. Logic and reason for all 3 examples. And finally, one that is often overlooked, you want to come back and you want to clinch this argument one more time. It's your last chance to persuade the reader of your argument. So a clincher will begin with words like thusly or therefore, or it becomes obvious that blah, blah, blah. Again, show you some examples in a few minutes. So argument 1, argument 2 is the same pattern, but you're just going to change the argument, different topic sentence, different evidence and examples. Same thing with argument number 3, same pattern. So your intro is your first paragraph. Argument 1, second paragraph, argument 2, third paragraph, and argument 3, fourth paragraph. You're going to use the same formula for each argument. Finally, your conclusion. That should be your 5th paragraph. You're just going to revisit your thesis, quickly review your arguments, and maybe leave the reader with something to think about at the end. So a good position paper, all of this put together, is going to be at least 3 pages single spaced, and you can double space it if you want to, beginning with your introduction. Hope you're good with that. Next thing I wanted to talk about would be, let's talk about some possible positions that you can take. So you've got your source. I've given you a source, and we'll take a look at it again. There's really 3 positions you can take based on that source. You can either completely agree with the source, you can disagree with the source, or you can, kind of agree with the source but not completely agree with the source. So a thesis can be complete agreement, disagreement, or maybe one of moderation, a little bit of both. Here are some possible ways to get your thesis going. History has proven that the source is correct in including that blah, blah, blah. Based on historical evidence, it becomes clear the perspective indicated by the source is wrong. The source is only partly correct when it assumes that blah, blah, blah. So there's the 3 good ways of beginning a thesis, and then you'll just fill in the rest of the wording for your position. Again, I'll show you some specific examples in a bit here. So here's a thesis that might be in complete agreement, disagreement, and there's your thesis that is one of moderation at the bottom here. We're going to talk about that in a bit. Possible topic sentences. The planned economy has failed as an economic alternative to capitalism. That's something that I could use evidence to prove. I'd go back, I'd dig through my notes, all of the articles I've read. I could prove that point. History has proven that as an economic ideology, classical liberalism is not without its flaws. I could prove that. I could prove that classical liberalism was not perfect. I could talk about the Industrial Revolution in Europe. I could talk about America in the 1920s. I could prove that topic sentence. Classical liberalism needed reform in order to provide citizens with a better quality of life. Yeah, that is something that I could prove. So a topic sentence needs to be general and something that you can prove with evidence. So if, for example, my topic sentence was talking about, let's say, the 5-year plans, I think that would be a really specific topic sentence. I think that would be too specific a topic sentence, because all I can talk about now would be the 5-year plans. I've cornered myself. To open up more evidence, you might think, well, what are the 5-year plans an example of? Well, collectivism, the planned economy. And then you could backtrack to a more generalized topic sentence, and now you can talk about more evidence. If you start your argument with the 5-year plans, you're stuck talking about the 5-year plans for that whole argument. So unless you're an expert, I would generalize to the planned economy. Here's some of the stuff that we studied in our look at economics. So classical liberalism. Those are some specific things we looked at. Your robber barons, the Industrial Revolution. One thing I left off was maybe the Panic of 1873, the first American Depression. You might want to talk about that. You don't have to. And you're not going to use all of these things in your paper. My God, that would be way too long. You're going to pick and choose what you're comfortable with, what you're good at, and maybe what fits with your argument. By the way, if you want to use the Great Depression as an argument against classical liberalism, you can, but you have to talk about how it was a result of classical liberalism. So without any government intervention in the Roaring Twenties, one could argue that culminated with the American Great Depression. They didn't insure the banks, they didn't regulate the stock market, which gave you the Great Depression. But in many ways, it was caused by classical liberalism. In terms of collectivism, that's what came to my mind when I thought about it. And again, you're not going to use all of it. You're going to pick and choose what works for you, what you know a lot about. So I've got one extreme, no government intervention. I've got the other extreme, complete and total government intervention. And then finally, well, I guess I should say, by the way, this is here again, just to remind you that if you were going to track maybe the rise and fall of the planned economy, or maybe establish that this was not a perfect system and did not work, talk about how maybe it worked for a while, but then devolved into what eventually became capitalism, or a private economy. And then we've got our moderate evidence. So if classical is extreme and the planned economy was extreme, modern liberalism would be your moderate evidence that you can pick and choose from too. And again, you're not going to use all of it. Okay. You might want to make use, well, no, I say you will want to make use of your economic spectrum. That's what it looked like to me. Yours may vary, and that's fine. But this is a really good way to pull your evidence. Everything you need to write about will be on your economic spectrum, and you're not going to write about all of it. You're going to pick and choose. But to me, when we built this, it served two purposes. Number one, it reviewed the information we'd studied. And number two, it's going to be the menu that you're going to use to pick your evidence for the position paper. And so on the extreme left, I've got complete collectivization. On the complete right, I've got complete individualism. No government involvement. And then everything in between is moderate government involvement. So a big teaching moment in 30-1. Modern liberalism is everything in between extreme collectivism and extreme individualism. Everything in between those two extremes is modern liberalism. And so if you were going to build a position paper that agreed with the source that I gave you, but maybe moderated it, you might say, look, argument number one, without government involvement, you get this. And that didn't really serve the common good. It didn't help the disadvantaged members of society. On the other hand, if you go too far and the government gets too involved in an economy, you get this. You get the 5-year plans, you get collectivization, you get the Holodomor, the murdering of the kulaks, the lack of rights and freedoms, not to mention that by the 1970s this system was collapsing and stagnating and was gone by the 1990s anyway. So you'll prove one extreme didn't work, the other extreme didn't work, but what did work was everything in the middle, the moderate evidence. So maybe an argument built around Keynesian economics. Maybe the whole argument's defending modern liberalism, and Keynesian economics would be piece of evidence number one. Evidence number two might be neoconservatism. Evidence number three might be the New Deal. That is completely up to you. But when I look at this spectrum, I see an argument to the far right saying that you need at least some government intervention or you get this. I see an argument to the far left saying you don't want too much government intervention. And then I see arguments coming from the middle, which is modern liberalism, just enough government intervention. So it's very much like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You know, one bed was too hard, one bed was too soft, the third one was just right. That might be how I approach this. That lets you use the full spectrum of evidence. If you want to completely disagree with that source and say that no, we need complete economic freedom, all you can really pick from is this side and this extreme. You can't do the middle. Take a look at that source one more time. So this guy's advocating for a government involvement in the economy. This guy wants government involvement in the economy. If I agree with him that the government should be involved, and I completely agree with him, I could talk about this extreme and I could talk about this extreme, but I would be omitting the middle evidence that comes under modern because I didn't establish that. If I were you, I would partly agree with this source. I would say the source is right, but only to a certain degree. Because if there's no government involvement, you're going to get this, and if there's too much, you're going to get this, and if there's just enough, you're going to get this, and this does a better job at serving the greater good, and it's got more longevity. There is no more classical liberalism anymore. There is no more planned economy anymore. But all of these systems still exist and are alive and well today. That's probably how I would approach this paper. By the way, this spectrum does not include Trudeau and Trump's economic response to the COVID-19 crisis. So you might want to use that as modern evidence too. And that's important. You want to mix up your evidence. Don't want to just draw evidence from the Industrial Revolution. You'd want to mention America in the Roaring Twenties or 1873. That's called breadth of evidence, not just picking evidence from one historical era. That's not what I'm after. Let's take a look at this. Different source. So this is a different economic source than the one I'm assigning you. But it's kind of getting at the same thing. This guy's saying that the government, again, should be involved in society to ensure the common good. Without this intervention, self-interest would undermine society. So again, this guy is calling for collectivism. He wants government involvement. This is just part of a paragraph that I wrote to try and get you started on this, beginning with my topic sentence. So here's my topic sentence for one argument that I'm going to build. Everything in green is my topic sentence. You want to keep referring to the source throughout your paper, not every single sentence, but you want to come back to that source at least one or two times in each argument. So there's my first topic sentence. I'm going to say that, listen, you need some government involvement. And the way I'm going to prove this is by examining classical liberalism during the Industrial Revolution in America in the early 1900s. Topic sentence. And then here's my first piece of evidence. Example 1. I mentioned Smith, and I talk about labor exploitation. Labor exploitation of the working class. Kids as young as 4 and 5 working in coal mines and factories. Today that would be criminal, which proves that maybe we do need some government involvement in the economy. So I didn't just drop the evidence in the paragraph. I explained the evidence from an historical perspective. So everything you see here below the green is just my first example, explaining my first example. To complete this argument, you've got to explain a second and a third example. And then at the end of this whole paragraph, this whole argument, you're going to clinch it. So the pink would be my clincher. Thus, it becomes clear that there needs to be boundaries to economic freedom in order to serve the common good. Clincher comes at the end. So if you added a second and a third example, this would be a decent looking paragraph. This would be a pretty good looking argument to help with my thesis and position paper. I hope that helped. Speaking of decent, there's the rubric. So it's for a mark out of 30 position papers. How well you analyze the source can get you a mark up to a 6 out of 6. So an excellent source analysis is very insightful, very sophisticated. Kid quotes and talks about that source specifically, can get a 6 out of 6 on average. Most kids get between satisfactory and proficient when they analyze the source. Argumentation is for a mark out of 8. So this is how well you establish and defend your position, how well you defend your arguments. So if you build a paper that only has 2 arguments instead of 3, going to be tough for you to get more than even a 4.8 out of 8, probably less than that too. Evidence is also for a mark out of 8, and this is the Achilles heel of a grade 12 kid, of any high school kid. Evidence needs to be specific. It needs to be thorough. It needs to be concise and insightful. It's got to be something that is provable. And I'll show you some samples in a minute, but evidence to get an 8 out of 8 is going to need specific numbers and dates and people, because it's got to be specific and it can't be wrong. As evidence becomes more generalized and straightforward, you start to lose marks out of the 8 for evidence. Finally, communication is actually worth a lot in the position paper. Communication is for a mark out of 8. And if you have a very strong command of the English language, you could get an 8 out of 8. And it doesn't mean that things are perfect, but they're close to perfect. Every paper is going to have warts and misspellings and things like that, and that's fine. But that doesn't mean that you still can't get a high mark, an 8 out of 8. I mean, if we took a mark off for every time you spelt a word wrong, your sentence structure was wrong, no one would get an 8 out of 8. It doesn't work that way. What else do I have to show you here? Okay. Here's a really good paper based on the source, like the sample source that we're looking at here. Good intro. I like how this writer has quoted parts of the source and explained them. Talked about what it means to undermine. What is the common good exactly? This is a good one. Her thesis is kind of right in here. And it's a good thesis. It's simple, it's straightforward. I know exactly what this kid is going to write about. By the way, when you make your thesis, avoid using personal pronouns like I, me, and we, because as soon as I use the word I or me, I'm no longer being objective. And you got to be objective on this paper. That's a nice intro. Argument number 1. She's attacking classical liberalism. Evidence she uses the white slaves, labor exploitation, children in factories, the working conditions themselves. She talks about the robber barons. I really like that. Robber barons of the United States. Not only does she talk about the robber barons, but she gives specific robber barons, Rockefeller and Standard Oil Trust, and just what percentage of the monopoly he controlled of America's oil refineries. The money he generated through his monopoly. So very specific evidence. One can hardly call that generalized. And then she talks about the lack of government regulation culminating with the American Great Depression. Really like the way she made that work. Again, specific digits. And she got these from the articles that we studied in class. Remember, we were supposed to read and highlight? That's where she got this evidence from. Argument 2. Looks like she's attacking too much government intervention. Yeah, she's attacking too much government intervention in argument number 2. And of course, she's going to attack the 5-year plans now. How they looked good on paper, but people were lying so they wouldn't get murdered. She talks about the kulaks and the Holodomor because they wouldn't go along with Stalin's collectivization. She's got specific digits again that are very researchable and very persuasive. You can't argue those numbers. The numbers are facts. And finally, she's going to support modern liberalism. So here's her, third argument. She's saying a bit of both would be nice. Here's her third approach. She's going to defend modern liberalism. So she's got Keynesian economics, which she explains, talks about fiscal and monetary policy, talks about Roosevelt and his New Deal as another example of government intervention. Again, some specific digits to go with that really prove her point. And finally, she talks about Sweden and democratic socialism. Again, specific digits, taxation rate of 68%. Compares it to the US. More specifics about democratic socialism in Sweden. Really like that. Could have had a stronger clincher, but that'll do. And then finally, there's her conclusion. This one's good. It's not perfect. Outstanding evidence. The wording was just a little rough. It could have been more polished. She could have been more persuasive in the way she worded things, but a really good example of how you use evidence. The other one I wanted to show you was a low excellent. So this one's good. This kid might have been a better writer, but didn't use the evidence as well. So this kid, really good writer, some strong language and vocabulary, but the evidence just wasn't as specific. And then you might lose a bit of persuasion when you don't have evidence that is as specific as it needs to be. So these are on D2L. I'll have instructions under the intro and where you can find them, because you might want to print these off and take a look at them and read them over to help you understand them better. But this one's good. Just could have used some more specific evidence, I think. But I liked it. Kid was a great writer. I remember her. Finally, satisfactory. Now, this isn't what your goal should be, but this gives you an idea of where someone can land on the rubric. So again, same source as the other two that they're responding to, but the languaging is very general. The argumentation is very general. There aren't a whole lot of specifics really in there, if any. Rather than a specific number, they generalize things. And you lose marks because of it. So it's not a bad paper. This kid still passed, but it just wasn't specific enough. It wasn't as detailed enough as it should be. So she's got labor exploitation down here, but doesn't really give the specific ages that you would want. I mean, it's one thing to say, you know, they had young kids working in factories. But if I told you they had 4-year-olds working in factories, that is much more persuasive. And that's what we're looking for. Wasn't crazy about the way she started off her third argument. I mean, it's just way too specific. American healthcare. If you introduce an argument with something specific like that, that's all you can talk about now in that argument. And she does, but she's not an expert on it. So it's really hard to build evidence from just the American healthcare system. So there is something else to think about too. I don't even know why I have that there. I guess just to get you thinking again too. I think that's it. I think that's all I've got to show you regarding the position paper. Okay. So one more time. That is your source. That's what you're going to respond to. I'm assigning this position paper officially right now. It's due next Tuesday. So it's due the day after Easter Monday. Please email me any questions you might have. Email me an outline. If you're thinking about that, I can give you some feedback. Let's take our time with this. Yes, it's open book. You can research facts and figures, but all you need, honestly, is this spectrum and all of your notes and all of those articles I gave you to read regarding the American economy, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, classical liberalism. I gave you a couple of articles last week online about Stalin's 5-year plans, about communism in the former Soviet Union. Those articles were given to you because they've got all the evidence you need. That's all the specifics that you're going to want. Last thing you'll want to do is Google economic systems or something. You're going to get way too much information, or it won't even be applicable for what you need. But there is your source for the first position paper. It was always going to be open book regardless of COVID-19. The first one was always going to be open book. I want it to be more of a learning experience. I want it to be a positive experience. The next one, there'll be some more strict regulations about writing that paper, but we won't worry about that for about another month. Okay, so good luck with you putting your paper together. Don't hesitate to ask me for help. I'm expecting you're going to have trouble. This will be the toughest thing you do in Social Studies 30-1. But I can make it easy if you ask for help. I hope this video helped, and good luck to you.